Hi there, welcome to TAS Film and TV Reviews. So this is my review of Season 2 of Beef, which is newly released on Netflix. So wherever possible, I'm going to avoid giving away spoilers here, but I will be talking about the main themes and ideas within the show. So if you haven't seen it yet, it might be best to go away and watch it and then come back here after. And this new season, it follows the pretty much universally acclaimed Season 1 of the same name, but it features an all-new cast and setting and is a standalone drama. And it's an 8-episode affair, and episodes come in anywhere from between half an hour to just shy of an hour. And it's created, written and directed by Korean national Lee Sung-jin, with additional directing duties from Jake Schreier and Kitao Sakurai. And as with Season 1, it's a character-driven piece of work, and in this series we follow millennial couple Oscar Isaac, who plays country club manager Josh, and his wife Lindsay, played by Carey Mulligan, an interior designer also working for the club. And then we have Gen Z couple Ashley, played by Cailee Spaeney, and Austin, played by Charles Melton, who are both lower level employees at the club. And in this series, the scope is also broadened somewhat to go international, and we have a Korean sort of family business enterprise who were going through an acquisition of the country club. And they're represented here by the elders Chairwoman Park, played by Yoon Yoo-jung, and her surgeon husband, Dr. Kim, played by Song Kang-ho. And the setup here is that we follow the trials and tribulations of each couple's relationship, whilst then also watching them compete or engage with the other couples with ever-increasing jeopardy across the season. And as with Season 1, we start off with a single incident, a beef, which then spirals out of control over the course of the season through a series of power plays, manipulations and zero-sum calculations by the main characters. Now of course Season 1, it was pretty much universally liked and enjoyed, so the risk was always going to be that the only way from there is down. But at the outset of this review, I really want to allay those fears, because as a standalone piece of work, I thought this was really accomplished, and despite broadening the scope of the series to go international, I still felt like it kept the best bits of what made Season 1 so good. So specifically, that's the character-driven nature of the drama, the storytelling, and then the sense of ambiguity that it engenders in the watcher. That idea that you might feel sympathy for a character in one episode and then viscerally hate them in the next. And there's a number of interesting themes and ideas that really jumped out to me as I watched this and which really kept me engaged across the 8 episodes. So firstly, I thought it was a really interesting study into the nature of human connection within our economic system. Because as you watch Josh and Lindsay and Ashley and Austin go about their business, it's a bit like watching a documentary of a sort of post-society society. From the word go, everyone at almost every moment in this drama is running a game down. There's plays within plays. Everyone is hustling to get ahead. And you get this sense right from the first episode that there's a sort of zero-sum logic to almost every decision that our protagonists make here. And the essential question always seems to be, how is this going to help me get ahead? And in that sense, I sort of thought it had a very Coen Brothers outlook to it. You pick up straight away that there are going to be unintended consequences arising from all these low-level capers and schemes in play. And that in turn then creates a sort of chaos over which our protagonists are quickly going to lose control. And that's most evident as we watch Josh and Lindsay in those early episodes. In the very first episode, we learn that Lindsay resents Josh for spending her inheritance money on care for his sick mother. And that then leads into the mother of all arguments, the beef, which in turn acts as the catalyst for the entire show. And it's sort of hard to escape a sense of nihilism really from our main characters. The drama really highlights a lack of shared bonds or collective endeavour, and it emphasises an almost total sense of sort of atomisation and individualism. And this of course is despite Josh and Lindsay being married, the idea of which is that you care for each other, you pull in the same direction, you support each other through better and worse. And there's a really interesting scene in the early episodes where Josh is thinking things over in his office. He's looking at a wedding photo of him and Lindsay on their big day. And then when it cuts away and then back to the photo, it's changed to a picture of him marrying himself. And then even when we see meaningful human connection on the screen, particularly in the early episodes through Ashley and Austin, it's emphasised that those feelings are so fleeting and illusory, because in their case, Ashley's jealousy and concern at losing that human connection causes her to basically have a meltdown and throw herself out of a car. And then in a later episode, we see that she sets up a new rule for them as a couple where they check each other's phones daily, which she puts in place to help manage her anxiety about Austin abandoning her. And what it highlights through both couples so well, but in slightly different ways in each case, is a sort of central ambiguity that we're so starved of meaningful relationship and connection that we go to extreme lengths to feel any love and connection. But then also, and often at the same time, we strive to have personal control and to advance our own needs. So there's this sort of cognitive dissonance in play amongst our 4 main protagonists as they interact with their significant others and as they ride those 2 horses. And I sort of thought that over the course of the 8 episodes, this really becomes something of a meditation on the nature of love and connection. connection within our economic system. And towards the end of the series, in the final act, Chairwoman Park and her husband, they're both opining about their outlook on love and relationships. And Chairwoman Park, she gives us this lengthy monologue about the nature of capitalism and how relationships have to exist within that system. So she describes how love and all relationships exist within the capitalist system, which she says is a system of nature, a system of the self. And it's just this sort of absurd libertarian outlook that's favoured by so many rich people to justify their obscene wealth. Because ultimately, by adopting that framing, she's willingly constructing barriers in her own life, such as having a prenup with her husband, to safeguard her material interests, but she's not considering what that might do to the quality of her relationships. And so I think her outlook and its role in the drama is to serve as an illustration of how money distorts our worldview and how it divides us. And I think it's Austin who gets closest to the truth on this subject when he's talking with Ashley about her need for love and support because of what happened in her early childhood and the lack of support from her parents. And in that discussion, he's emphasising that as humans, we yearn for deep connection, which of course comes from our parents initially, because if we're loved unconditionally as children, we're then also capable of the same as we become adults. But if we're not, then of course we develop faulty attachment mechanisms which follow us through life. And that was also then picked up on when Austin talked to his mum on the phone, and she apologises to him for beating him when he was a child, because that resulted in him always seeking to please other people. So this series, it's entertainment, but it's also deceptively deep in many places. They're trying to weave in ideas about child attachment, they're using a Marxist critique of our economic framework, they're talking about the nature of love in late stage capitalism and whether that's even possible. So there's a lot to unpick, and I'm really glad that they tried to explore some of these ideas because it made the show richer for it. And then I also wanted to pick up on the expert use of music in this series, because on the subject of our economic system, the use of music across this series is absolutely brilliant in emphasising some of the themes that I've just mentioned. And it's got a great popular culture soundtrack, a lot of which is from the mid to late 2000s. And it engenders this sense of nostalgia, particularly if you're of a certain age. And we see that especially through Josh. He has these ideas about creating his own holiday retreat come music festival, with Hot Chip constantly referred to across the series. And the music acts like a bookmark in time, because Hot Chip had their breakout hit in 2006, which if you remember back is probably the last time any normal person, i.e. people who are not rich, felt hope in our economic system or with their life in general. It's just before the financial crash from which we've never recovered. And there's an absolutely brilliant episode in which Josh and Lindsay's dog Burberry goes missing, and then somehow Josh ends up DJing with Hot Chip while his wife Lindsay's out looking for their missing dog. And in that context, the music also acts as a great metaphor for the notion that our nostalgia for past times is often an illusion anyway, because quite often it will be a recollection of a time when we didn't have responsibility. So for Josh it's having a dog and the responsibilities that come with that, or for another millennial it might be having kids and the responsibilities that come with that. But all of which is to say that when we were young, we enjoyed life because we were young, and we enjoyed life more then because life wasn't as hard then as it is now. And so the music is a great medium through which to tell that story and to explore some of those ideas. And then following on from that, I also thought the series was a really fascinating insight into who and what we value and how we express that value in material ways. So the healthcare system is the easiest expression of that, I think, across the 8 episodes. And I have to say that as a Brit and as someone who is used to living with the NHS, so getting healthcare free at the point of use, paid for via general taxation, this series is an absolutely scathing assessment of the US healthcare system. And I think there's really 3 strands of this health side of the story which emphasise that point. So firstly, we have Ashley's hospitalisation after she jumps out of a moving car and falls into a lake. Then we have the scene in Burberry's pet hospital after he gets mauled by a coyote. And then finally, we have the plastic surgery clinic in Korea, where all these rich people are going to have their faces and bodies altered. And the reason why I thought this was important in terms of the storytelling was because it basically highlights that everything is upside down and back to front. The scene in which Ashley's being treated in hospital is so bleak. Like, it's chaotic, it's busy, dirty, it's uncaring, bureaucratic. But then if you contrast that to the scene at the pet hospital, or indeed the plastic surgery clinic, both of those environments are clean, they're orderly, they're well staffed, they're well resourced. And ultimately that says that we care more for our animals or for enhancing our bodies and faces than we do for our poorest people. There was an absolutely great scene in the hospital which exemplified that. There's a nurse asking Ashley about her subjective pain, and then there's a lengthy back and forth about what number constitutes real pain. And I just thought it was a quite witty and fun way of highlighting that in this economic system, which basically rules every aspect of our life, including things which have no business being monetized like healthcare, everything and everybody can be quantified and turned into a 1 or a 0. So we get this idea that everyone is a consumer and a number on a spreadsheet with no inherent value other than what the spreadsheet dictates. And then that scene with Ashley at the hospital, it also captured the sense of despair of those who unfortunately come into contact contact with these systems. Anyone who's not rich will understand what Ashley feels when she's recovering from her hospital stay. That sense of feeling, on the one hand, glad that the immediate issues have been dealt with, but then the looming spectre of financial ruin as she contemplates paying off the bill. And at one point she even says, I feel bad for taking up a bed. And it just highlights how we internalise these powerful forces in our life. It's not just that we should feel grateful for any support, it's that when we're seriously injured, we should also feel that someone else is worse off, that we don't deserve this, or that we're lucky to get what meagre support is offered. And ultimately, all of that I've just described is manufacturing consent for a small state which doesn't care and which doesn't provide for its citizens, which only seeks to maximise profit. And then finally, the pièce de résistance in that hospital scene was when Ashley tries to reach out to her dad for support, but he's at a Lakers game and he can't respond. And then you compare that to the love and anguish that Lindsay and Josh feel when Burberry's in the hospital being treated. And the series as a whole just really picked up so well on those contradictions at the heart of the systems that govern our life. And then I also thought this series was a really interesting meditation on competition between the social classes and also between the generations. So I've seen a number of films and shows recently which explore the idea of class in America and the loss of the American dream. And I thought the Koreans being in the dominant ruling capitalist class here is interesting. And I wondered if this was a reference to sort of maybe the MAGA movement or populism more generally. Because ultimately, as the drama unfolds, both couples end up fighting against this powerful and omnipotent multinational behemoth. And that taps into this populist idea of the global elite swanning around whilst ordinary people are struggling. And then the country club setting is also absolutely perfect. It's all about status and it's the perfect representation of the conflict we see playing out on the screen between the two couples. Lindsay and Josh are looking at all these successful, rich, famous people that they interact with at the club. We can see their jealousy and their longing to be accepted play out on the screen. And then they in turn take on this dismissive attitude in their interactions with Ashley and Austin. These low-wage Gen Z employees, people who they can pin anything on because they're so thick and naive. And Ashley and Austin, on the other hand, they're so desperate to get ahead, to get out from under, that they take on the behaviours of those above them in the pecking order, even though they initially start off seeing them as abhorrent. And I thought the mirroring of the two couples, in terms of how their place in the social hierarchy holds them back, whilst also showing the conflict within and between the couples, was really skillfully done. And the dialogue really contributed to that visceral sense of hatred between the generations. And the example that sticks out is when Josh goes to visit Ashley in the hospital and she says "F off boomer," and of course using boomer as a pejorative, which is absolutely perfect for Josh because he's just such a douchebag. And then I also thought it picked up on the differing responses to our apocalyptic economic system from the different generations really well. So Gen Z, Ashley and Austin, they've got this sort of optimism, this sense of naive hope, and they're thankful for small positives, at least initially, whereas the millennials, Josh and Lindsay, they're burnt out and they're disillusioned. And the boomers, Chairwoman Park and her husband, they're paranoid, they're worried about losing their income, their assets, or their control more generally. But in the final analysis, the overall premise remains the same for each couple. There's side hustles on top of side hustles. It's the get ahead at all costs mantra. That idea that disappointment and greed go hand in hand. So there was so much to draw from the storytelling on this subject, I think. It was really good. And then in terms of other ideas and themes to note, I think there's a decent exploration of the different ideas of love, relationships, and the meaning of family between East and West. So in this case, between American culture and Korean culture. I think there's some hints at the different experiences of second generation migrants, so Josh and Austin in this case, and the impact of parenting practices that might differ between cultures and what that means for people in a Western context. And then I touched on it briefly earlier, but there's also a sort of darkly comic portrayal of the cost of plastic surgery and what that says about an individual and also about our culture more widely. So there's absolutely loads to get your teeth into and think about with this series. But I think in the interest of brevity, I thought it might be wise just to mention that these ideas are there and are explored somewhat, which, given everything I've already talked about, I think is quite an achievement in only 8 episodes, really. And of course, I've been talking all this time and I haven't even mentioned the performances or the technical elements of the show yet, because on both counts, I think it's a real triumph. Now, clearly on the back of season 1, they've been able to expand the scope of the show in almost every direction. And they've drawn in some Hollywood royalty. Both Oscar Isaac and Carey Mulligan are absolutely great in this. Isaac plays Josh's sort of hapless douchebag so well. And Mulligan is also excellent as the kind of stuck-up Brit who's, got ideas above her station. And then Cailee Spaeney's performance as Ashley here was also really enjoyable, particularly her metamorphosis into a bunny boiler. And then likewise, Yoon Yoo-jung as Chairwoman Park and Song Kang-ho as her surgeon husband are both great as well. But for me, it's really Charles Melton as Austin who's the star star of the show in this. You know, I absolutely loved his facial expressions, his turn of phrase, and just his simple understanding of so many aspects of modern life. And I know a lot of that will be in the writing, but his delivery and how he always seems to be at the centre of everything, but yet also slightly bewildered and above all the madness that surrounds him, is absolutely brilliant. And he's also got just such a lovely warm face, and as is pointed out in the later episodes, just a lovely smile. So for me, it's just a top performance from him. It's I really enjoyed it. And then I mentioned it just there, but the writing is both witty and to the point, but it's also deceptively deep. You know, as I've touched on, the script explores a wide range of topics, but it does that without getting bogged down or laboured at any point, really. And then similarly, the character development is also excellent. You know, you feel warmth and animosity to the main characters at the right times, and you get a sense of who these people are from the very first episode. You know, I wouldn't say you care for them necessarily at any point, because they've all got sort of significant character defects, but you're invested in them from the start and you want to know what happens. And then finally, the cinematography is also great here. You know, it was shot on a particular type of camera which allows for a sort of high-end cinematic look, but on the small screen. So it just brings all the colour to life. So it looks absolutely amazing. And yeah, in summary, this is well worth a watch. You know, it's a great follow-up to season 1. We've got absolutely great performances. It looks amazing. And there's so much to think about here. And despite essentially telling a story about the vacuousness of modern life, it's a drama that is so rich in meaning and which is highly thought-provoking. So there's absolutely loads of good stuff that's been crammed into these 8 episodes, but at the same time it never felt rushed either. So I thoroughly enjoyed it and I would highly recommend it to anyone. And if you've seen it, you know, let me know in the comments, what did you think about Beef season 2? And did I miss anything? You know, what were the things that you took away from watching this show? And of course, yeah, thank you for watching and I will see you in the next one.